All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of our 3-day lecture series in honor of Professor John Hope Franklin, a towering member of the history department and the larger University of Chicago community. I won't go into specifics again today, but let me again thank all of the people across campus who have worked incredibly hard to make this event possible. Thank you so very much. Yesterday, we enjoyed a phenomenal lecture from Professor Elizabeth Hinton, and today we have the honor of hearing our second lecture, this one from the dynamic scholar, author, activist, and leader, Professor Heather Thompson. I face what is now a familiar predicament. If I were to attempt a full summary of Professor Thompson's achievements, we would not get to hear from Professor Thompson. So I will offer a condensed biography to maximize our engagement with this incredibly accomplished scholar. Professor Heather Ann Thompson is a native Detroiter and a historian at the University of Michigan. She is the author of Who's Detroit? Politics, Labor, and Race in a Modern American City, which is a seminal study of Black politics in urban America in the 1960s and 1970s, and Blood in the Water, the Attica prison uprising of 1971 and its legacy. It is difficult to overstate the importance of this book. Among many honors, Blood in the Water was named a finalist for the National Book Award, and it was winner of the Pulitzer and Bancroft Prizes, among many, many others. In vivid prose, Blood in the Water draws on interviews, police reports, and other government records to make visible the structurally unjust conditions that precipitated the rebellion, the uprising itself, and the useful deceptions that in many ways hid from view the uprising, hindered efforts toward redress, and helped to legitimize the subsequent explosion of our incarcerated population, due in part to the Rockefeller drug laws and mandatory sentencing structures. This past spring, Professor Thompson was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship to write her next book on the MOVE bombing of 1985. As a public intellectual, Professor Thompson writes regularly for an array of outlets and has served as the lead historical consultant on several documentaries. Professor Thompson's policy work includes service on the historic National Academy of Sciences Blue Ribbon panel that studied the causes and consequences of mass incarceration in the US. She currently serves on the Standing Committee on Law and Justice, also of the National Academy of Sciences. Professor Thompson is a former president of the Southern Labor Studies Association and currently serves as president of the Urban History Association. Today, Professor Heather Ann Thompson will share with us a lecture titled The Burdens of History, Policing, Prisons, and the Dizzying Power of the Past on the Present. Professor Thompson.
Thank you so much. You'll have to excuse me. I got a little directionally challenged coming here, so I'm a little winded, a little wet, but I will try to get it together here to commence this lecture. But first, I want to really thank all of you for inviting me here, thanking particularly the Department of History and the chair, Dr. Curry. It is particularly a pleasure to be here at this department. There are so many people in this department who not only I respect so much as scholars, but of course, long-term good friends, long-time good friends, of course, Jane Daly, but so many more people and amazing graduate students who I've known, some of whom known for a very long time, but also new students who we got to meet today at lunch, which was really great. I think I've got 10 new books that I feel like, well, they're certainly going to write, but what I wish that I would have imagined writing a long time ago. But mostly, I'm really thrilled that the committee thought to invite Elizabeth Hinton and I here. You should know that it's a particular dream of both she and I to be able to be on a panel like this together, even though it is a hybrid panel, because we have collaborated so much together over the years. And to kind of share this space officially is really important to us because we've spent so many really years collaborating on these ideas, you know, just hammering out these concepts that we've kind of shared, things that she shared with you yesterday, things that I'll try to share with you today, and to do this kind of officially, thanks to the committee that invited us. It really means a lot. And so thank you so much, Roshana Johnson, for inviting us. And of course, your work means so much to both of us. So thank you. It is also, as Elizabeth Hinton said, such an honor to be here in honor of John Hope Franklin, a man that I had the real pleasure of meeting several times when I was a professor in North Carolina. And I'll never forget his generosity of spirit, really spirit of mentorship. Just something that you'll never forget if you ever had the honor of meeting him, but also a real profound impact on me as a younger scholar for his insistence, always insistence on probing the archive, on looking for what was not there, for insisting on looking for what was not there and demanding to see what was not there and creating archives that were not there, and for insisting on what was really unpopular at a time when it was probably hard enough to get an audience for what he wanted to write and what he wanted to say, which was on the imperative of writing the past as it actually happened, and not not as those seeking to maintain power said it had happened. And I will never really forget that. Because I must say that since finishing Blood in the Water, and the deeper that I get into writing this book on Move, the more I become really obsessed with thinking through the implications of this most powerful dictum. And this afternoon, by drawing from my work on both Attica and now increasingly the work that I'm doing on Move, that's what I really would love to talk to you about today. I'd like to share with you this argument that I think is something that I'm really coming around to as at least to me, really important, which is, I think, a need to, and I don't know how to turn my PowerPoint on, but if someone could help me, so I can move to my next slide, or maybe the first slide, which is, this one, which is that I really think that it is time for a really serious re-reckoning with the 1960s and the 1970s in the spirit of what Dr. Franklin was calling upon us all to do. And that's everything from the really big terms that have really become associated with this decade, terms such as violence, crime, but also something even bigger than that, the bigger historiographical questions that are really pressing, things that we think that we have a fairly good handle on. For people like me who do carceral state history, things like, why did we become the world's largest incarcerator? But other questions, things like what happened to the promise of the social and political promise of the 1960s and 70s, everything from the Black freedom struggle, the women's movement, the welfare rights movement, and on and on and on. There's so many questions. And to be clear, we have plenty of arguments for all these things that people have been, I think, for quite some time, fairly satisfied with. But the thing is, and here's the whisper of John Hope Franklin in our ear, when we approach the historical record anew, in this case, the decade of the 60s and 70s anew, and specifically when we take a much closer look at some of the most powerful moments in these particularly tumultuous decades, in which Black citizens mobilized collectively to access needed resources or to demand long overdue rights. And when we look at what they actually said and did, and also when we take a much more critical and careful look at how their collective actions were then responded to as well as portrayed by state actors at the time, our perspective on these iconic decades shimmies a bit, shapeshifts, and at the very least, I want to argue, requires some new historical attention, and maybe more, I think, requires some historiographical reframing. In really profound ways, for example, I think, at least to me, it's become clear that the very decades that many Americans most associate with an expansion of civil rights and civil liberties were in fact decades utterly tethered to what in fact and would ultimately reveal itself to be, or reveal themselves to be, an unbudging color line. One that was around the clock, protected by literally any means necessary. Lies, corruption, murders, bombings, beatings, and mainly by a relentless criminalization carried out at enormous taxpayer expense and with the explicit and implicit condoning by those with privilege, power, and access, of course, and national control of the courts, the police, and of the crowning glory, which was the prisons. This shift, this shape shifting may seem obvious, but it actually isn't, because to really reckon with this means seeing new things. It means recognizing that historical actors on the ground at that moment, you see new historical actors on the ground. It changes the history on the ground at the moment in ways that new actors reveal themselves. It also, I think, changes the future history of the nation in ways that we did not fully appreciate. But I also think that it really has an impact on the way that we scholars understood the period, the way we later told what happened. I think there's countless examples of this. I think there's many, many examples in Dr. Hinton's book that we already heard, but I want to just tap into some of these examples, at least how I see them in my own work. I'm getting nothing. Next slide. To first dip into the next slide, which would be Attica, and that is the story of what happened at Attica. I won't spend a lot of time with this, but what happened? I mean, exactly 50 years ago, this year, for 4 long days and 4 long nights, Americans sat riveted before their television sets as nearly 1,300 men stood together for a number of things, but at bottom, basic human rights. These are men fed on 63 cents a day. These are men with living under abominable conditions, men who are given 1 square toilet paper a day, enduring the trauma of strip cells, regular beatings, racial epithets, barbaric medical treatment, you name it. And between September 13th, 1971, next slide, and September 9th and September 13th, 1971, these nearly 1,300 men stand together. They invite reporters in, they bring in famous observers to oversee their negotiations with state officials that take place inside of the prison itself. And they give heartfelt, passionate speeches about the conditions they long endure. The nation looks on. I mean, remarkable numbers of citizens look on, and they are actually remarkably moved by what they hear, by what they see. These are Americans that we wouldn't know it looking back years later, but these are Americans that were actually, these are Americans who had been moved by having read Tom Merton's Accomplices to the Crime, which was a best-selling expose of the barbaric conditions that had been, for example, in Arkansas's Cummins prison farm. These are people who, if you look back at polling data, were coming around very, very strongly to the idea that prisons were warehouses that should be rethought, that community corrections was something that we should really start to think about seriously. Community-based solutions made a lot of sense. This was a nation that had moved away from the death penalty. This was a nation where parole reform had an enormous amount of support, in fact. This was a nation that, in fact, had really made enormous movement towards the idea that prisoners, in fact, not only had some rights, but in fact had fundamental civil rights. They did not, in fact, check them at the door when they were given sentences. And so as the Attica uprising unfolded, while the pressures on the ground were particularly mounting on the liberal commissioner, Russell Oswald, certainly to stop mollycoddling the rebels was mounting. To be sure, those forces existed. Nevertheless, there was substantial support to see this resolve itself, not only in peaceful fashion, but with something positive coming out on the other side. And in fact, as a result of these negotiations that incidentally go on for 4 long days, 4 long nights, the state, or at least the liberal commissioner, manages to come to accord with the folks inside on 28 of the 33 demands. A real movement on pretty substantial demands towards fundamentally changing not just what goes on this institution, but what is going to go on throughout New York State, what's going to go on throughout the nation. Now, of course, I'm highly simplifying the story, but there is we have limited time, and this is to get to a broader point. The key here is that 2A1, there is a great deal of consensus that this must end with something positive coming out on the other side, and it must end peacefully. The observers, the media, the public who's writing in, the public who's being interviewed, pretty much everybody except for, of course, and unsurprisingly, townspeople who are on the scene from the town, people who, of course, have loved ones inside who are hostages, but notably, even the hostages themselves are in favor of what the prisoners want. They too have been working in this place. They too understand by this point, this is something that might benefit them. All of them understand that the worst thing that could happen would be a storming of this prison by force. And why do they understand that? Because everybody can see what's happened in the same 4 days and 4 nights, which is that over 600 troopers from around the state of New York have descended on Attica. These are men that have been passing out weapons like candy. They have been not writing down serial numbers of these weapons. They have been itching, frothing at the bit to get into this prison, to exact revenge on these overwhelmingly Black and brown prisoners on the inside. And these are men who are clear in their mission, which is not just to get inside, but to have a very high death toll if they do. It is clear what's going to happen, and it is clear that every single party, including the American public, is against these men going in. And nevertheless, what's going to happen is that the Governor Nelson Rockefeller, the liberal Republican, quote unquote, is going to send in the state troopers. And what ensues within 15 minutes is 120 men being shot to death, some 6-7 times. Both hostages and prisoners lay dead and dying. 39 men lay dead and dying. As one traumatized National Guard puts it, the trooper assault on the prison had left in its wake, quote, more blood, more gunshot wounds, more injuries that day than most people see in a typical day in combat, certainly in Vietnam. The media on the scene, the visitors at home, in front of televisions, listening in front of their radios, were frankly stunned. This, however, had been completely unavoidable, I should say. This had absolutely had to happen. It was regrettable, it was terrible, it was shocking, it was horrible, but it actually had to happen. And it had not happened because of the troopers that had gone in. It happened because of the prisoners. State officials stepped out in front of this prisoner and they told the American public that something completely different than had in fact happened. State troopers did not do this. The prisoners did this. The prisoners had in fact gone in there. The prisoners had in fact killed the hostages. The prisoners had slit the throats of the hostages. The prisoners had killed the guards. And in fact, the only reason why the troopers had to do what they had to do was to defend the hostages and to defend themselves from these marauding, these animalistic, these barbaric prisoners. And in fact, the prisoners had even castrated one of the guards and shoved his testicles in his mouth. And they had seen this with their own eyes, and they'd actually killed some of the guards ahead of time, and they had actually buried some of them in the yard 3 days earlier. This is the kind of barbarism that we cannot tolerate in this nation. And the Commissioner of Corrections said, this is the kind of armed insurrection that we cannot tolerate. We stand between you and the kind of barbaric, animalistic craziness that, you know, that's what goes on in other kinds of countries. And this is what we are protecting. And the American people's like, my God, yes, oh Lord, right? This was the accounting that went out on the front page of the New York Times, the LA Times, every small town in between, because it went out on the UPI, the AP network. But that's not what happened. What really happened? That was what was in the archives. But that's not what happened. What really happened? Well, what really happened is what took me 13 years to find out what really happened. What really happened was a whole bunch of stuff. But we now know that Rockefeller was told point blank by his own men, by his military men, that if he went into that prison, he would kill his own hostages. He would kill his own state employees. We now know that they deliberately did not give the men on the day they went in an ultimatum. They deliberately did not let them know that if they didn't surrender, they would all be killed. We now know that on the 13th of September, we now know that everybody that was killed on the day was killed by a law enforcement weapon in cold blood from the minute that the gas cleared. We now know that the gas was dropped first so that everyone would be incapacitated. We now know that the gas that was dropped was so lethal, so awful that they were choking, they were vomiting, they couldn't see, they were completely incapacitated when all those guns started shooting. We now know that when the troopers went in with those state issue weapons, with personal weapons, that they had ammunition outlawed by the Geneva Convention. We now know that they took off their identifying badges. We now know that they hunted down prisoners, that they killed state employees in the process. We now know that they concealed the serial numbers off of their guns. We now know that they mercilessly tortured those men for days, for weeks, for months, and then they denied it, and then they covered it up. We now know that the investigation that was put in place by the governor's office afterwards, that the same troopers that carried out this assault were put in charge of the investigation. We now know that they scooped up the evidence. They buried it behind the prison. And the rest of the evidence, they actually spliced film, doctored photographs, burned evidence, literally burned it in fireplaces, intimidated witnesses, threatened witnesses, allowed certain troopers to retire, perjured themselves, and so forth and so on. We now know that they spent millions of dollars to do this. State lawyers, federal lawyers, elected officials, and so forth and so on. They collected statements. They had 3 versions of the trooper statements, not one. They had prosecutors making cases to the grand jury, not one grand jury, 2 grand juries. We know that of all the evidence collected, tortuously contrived evidence, it was all intended to implicate the prisoners. Not one single trooper was indicted, but 62 prisoners were. And we now know that this torture that went on was denied for 30 years, 30 years. That these men were rounded up like a scene out of any horrific scene in any horrific chapter of any horrific history book we could write. And that these men that were paraded in front of cameras for the next decades cemented in people's minds the criminality of so many later generations of Black men and prisoners and what Attica was all about. And the way then that Attica, the way that state officials responded to and then spun and then frankly continued to protect themselves in the wake of the Attica uprising, therefore had an incalculable impact on what happened and what would happen in New York, as well as the nation more broadly vis-a-vis criminal justice policy thereafter. In short, it would do incalculable damage to public support for prisoner rights in this country. Something still, although we wouldn't know it, remarkably robust well into the 1970s. It would help to bolster a war on crime that, to be sure, had begun. It absolutely had begun. It had begun powerfully. And the literature and really important work that's been done on that is absolutely right. The war on crime had begun. Leah is real. Johnson drew lines in the sand to start that war on crime. But the devil is in the details. If you look at When does the incarceration rate rise? Not in 1965, not in 1966, not in 1967, not in 1968, not in 1969, not in say, the incarceration rate does not rise until about 1973. Actually, dramatically after about 1973. And there are major, major historiographical wrinkles then in this story. The ways in which we tell the story, the ways in which we tell the war on crime story, the ways in which we tell the story about why it happens and when it happens and on whose behalf it happens. And the story is not just about the war on crime, but also the story about the 1960s and about when it's over and about when it's done, right? And about when the right really rises. And in fact, we get to the point in the 1980s and the 1990s that it seems like such a fait accompli, everyone's locked up and the right is everywhere. And it just seems like the 60s is done, the 60s is over, and whatever happened to the welfare state and whatever happened to any hope for social justice. And we start writing about the rise of the right as if it's done and it's finished. And the left, man, when was that? And when did it ever happen? And you know, every working class person was conservative and everybody wanted the right, and the silent majority triumphed at about 1966, 67, 68, and it was done. It was wrapped up and it was sewn up, except for then we look at the story of Attica and we realize that the reason why those 62 prisoners don't actually all go to jail is because between 1972 and basically, I don't know, 1980, one of the most dramatic social justice, civil rights, legal defense efforts in American history starts and defends the Attica brothers. It draws people from all across this nation that actually stand together to resist the state cover-up, to resist the fact that these men have been railroaded. And in fact, there's all kinds of social justice movements in the 1970s we are now discovering, lo and behold. And actually, we discovered that the 1970s has enormous pushback to what's going on. And actually, we discovered that some of the most important prisoner rights cases actually happened in the 1970s, actually later. Like Estelle versus Gamble, one of the most important cases to establish medical rights within prisons. That's after Attica. How can that be? How can that be? I thought everything was sewn up, everything was done. No, it's not done, it's contested. The 70s is contested. But how does it become so sewn up? It becomes so sewn up in no small part because of how it is told and how it is narrated and how it is, we are told that it is sewn up. And in fact, the power of the activism of the 60s and 70s, lest we doubt how serious it was, here's something to ponder. At Attica in 1971, it's a tiny town, it's a tiny state prison. And yet on the scene, when that thing jumps off, the FBI is there and teletypes are going, minute by minute teletypes are basically going from that space, that place, to the CIA. Okay, you get that maybe. Do we really get that? The CIA? The president, the vice president, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, the federal marshals, the Attorney General. And so everybody's watching what's going on, right? Because the stakes are high. Everyone's real clear how the stakes are. And so even as the Attica brothers are losing their battle, the battle is not lost. And that is what we lose so often in our historiography. And that becomes an essential fact. But was it just Attica? Well, I'm now into MOVE and I don't know the full story yet. I'm just here, but what happens? Well, a year after Attica, 1 year after Attica, about the time the Attica grand jury is first convening, just about ready to hand on its indictments of all these 62 prisoners, about 345 miles away in Philadelphia, a man named John Africa has just founded an organization called MOVE. That city had had its own traumas with law enforcement, just like Rochester, New York, and Harlem, and Detroit, and Chicago, and we could go on and on and on, because if you've read Elizabeth Hinton's beautiful book, you know that every city in this country is on fire, as she says. And the thing about that period in Philadelphia in 1964, the resistance to this police violence had resulted in some pretty profound changes. On the one hand, it had birthed a really profound shift in city politics. It had really paved the way for the rise of an important Black middle class in that city. And that mattered a lot, but it had also done nothing at some fundamental level to the police. Rizzo, to your right, kept a lockjaw on the police department, and police brutality in that city ran rampant. It continued to run rampant in that city, and it did not change. And the reality of that setting in after the uprising of 1964 had some interesting impacts. On the one hand, it galvanized activism in some respects like it had never been before. Again, we wouldn't know that, but the 70s is a hotbed of activism in Philadelphia. The Panthers, the Revolutionary Action Movement, so many activists in Philly in the 70s. That was one response to it on the part of the Black community. But another response to it was actually move, which is disillusionment. Check out, stay home. John Africa was in this latter group of people, so disillusioned with what he called the system. Check out, stay home. Basically, you cannot trust this system. We've got Black leaders in office, Black middle class leaders. They keep saying they're going to do something. They're not doing anything. They can't rein in this police department. Can't trust white leaders, can't trust Black leaders, can't trust anybody. We're going to check out. We're going to stay home. We're going to grow our own food. We are going to stay home. We are going to reimagine society. We are going to do things that at the time seemed a little wacky. Today seems pretty okay. We call it being a vegan. We call it recycling. We do things today that at the time might have seemed a little hippie-ish, a little strange, but that's what they did all the time. They decided things that you shouldn't be cruel to animals. You should recycle your food. They had a raw diet. They did not believe in eating animals. And they really did not believe in what they called the system. They believed live a simpler life. Do not litter, do not do this, do not do that. And they kept every imaginable animal in their house. They renounced materialism, the larger society. They actively resisted racism. You would not know it, but it was actually a multiracial organization, overwhelmingly African-American, but in fact, multiracial. They had Latinx members as well as white members, and they were deeply reclusive. And at first, they pretty much stayed that way. Eventually, though, they start to get in many more conflicts with the police. Why? Because they start to protest. What are they protesting? They're protesting pet stores. Why? Because pet stores hold animals in cages. They protest the zoo. Why? Because zoos hold animals in cages. They protest the school department because they feel the school board, because they feel like the school is not educating Black children the same way that it's educating white children, and basically not educating children at all, just perpetrating these same materialistic values. So they're out there protesting, and the more they protest, they're getting arrested and arrested and arrested and arrested. And the more they get arrested, they're getting beaten up. And the more they're getting beaten up and the more they're getting arrested, the more they're realizing that the real problem is the police. And the more their problem is the police, the more militant and bombastic they're getting. And the more they start to protest, and the more they start to protest, the more they get into conflicts with the police. By 1976, they are in such regular conflict with the police because of their protests at the Philadelphia School Board and so forth, and the zoo, that all of a sudden something else starts to happen, which is Child Protective Services is coming around all the time. And the zoning department is coming around all the time. And basically every social service is coming around all the time. And when they are falling afoul of all of these, because they're not doing whatever they're supposed to do, fix the front porch or do this or do that. By the way, incidentally, all of these agencies can't find anything wrong with the way they're raising their children. They can't find anything wrong with what they're doing. So they just fine them. for very nuisance things. They fine them for nuisance. And when they don't pay the nuisance fees, then they get arrested. Does it sound familiar? Bail falling apart, you're falling down on bail, so they get arrested. This goes on, this goes on, this goes up, but they're getting madder and madder and madder. And here's why they're mad. Because anyone know much about Pennsylvania? What does Pennsylvania have? Amish people. And they are acutely aware that the Amish people are not being harassed like this. And this sticks in their craw because they know that Amish people are also homeschooling their children. Amish people are also being kind of left alone to do what they want to do. Amish people also keep pets and have farms and do whatever they want to do, but Amish people are not being harassed like this, or this is their thinking. So they are really, really upset about this. So they start going down to City Hall and protesting, but they do it very bombastically. They're using 4-letter words like water, and they're drawing enormous attention to each other. They've all decided that their last name is Africa because Africa is the most original birthplace of civilization. Again, back to the simple life, back to origin of humankind. They start to all eventually have dreadlocks because they want natural hair, they want natural everything. And it is brewing for a crisis. Why is it brewing for a crisis? Because again, well, I'll get to what we know. We don't know anything right now. There are going to be two major clashes that happen. One in 1978 and the other in 1985. And by taking an even cursory look at these now infamous moments, we can now see that they do incredibly important symbolic work to settle, and I use that in quotation marks, some deeply troubling questions about what I said earlier, were the glaring racial inequalities that were still there after the uprisings of the 1960s, right? We had these uprisings, we have a rise of a Black middle class, and everybody can't help but notice that there's still some troubling things, right? We still got terrible police brutality. Black Philadelphians are still dramatically poorer than white Philadelphians, for example, right? But these clashes are going to do some really important work. And bear with me because I'm still working on this, right? This is a work in progress, but this is what I'm at least feeling like I'm finding so far. In 1978, MOVE members lived in a house in Powelton Village. If you know anything about Philadelphia, this is where Drexel University is. It's very, very close to Penn. It's at the time, it was kind of this hippie enclave kind of neighborhood, kind of beautiful old Victorian houses. And John Africa was known in the neighborhood as the dog man because he always had tons of dogs around him. He walked other people's dogs. Again, MOVE was known as animal lovers. They were always seen as eccentric, a little weird. And of course, you know, neighbors were a little unsettled by the fact there were so many dogs at their house, and because they ate raw food and because they believed in recycling back when no one recycled, you know, there was always, you know, rats around their house. It was a little, you know, a little unnerving, but they were always nervous. They didn't want to call the police on these people because again, this is 6 years after the Black Panther Party, you know, in Chicago. This is after Fred Hampton's been murdered in Chicago. People don't want to call the police, especially if you live in a neighborhood that is like Powelton Village. And so, remember I told you these guys are getting arrested on a routine basis for their little violations in their house. On March 28th, 1977, a bunch of MOVE members had come home from jail. They had just been released. And they came home one night. And according to MOVE, when they came home that night, Rizzo's police officers were waiting for them, lying in wait for them. And you know, this, according to the neighbors, was corroborated. All of this I'm still working on. But whatever happens, there is an altercation on the lawn. And in this altercation, one of the MOVE members, Janine Africa, is in this fray with the police officers, and she's pushed to the ground and she has a baby in her arms, and the baby ends up getting crushed. And according to MOVE, her baby is killed. And after this, everything changes dramatically. What happens next is going to change everything. MOVE, which has been kind of protesting and willing to go down to City Hall and protest and willing to still be very insular in its life, draws a line in the sand. It decides that it is not going to take this anymore. It decides it's going to draw a line in the sand and it's going to become more militant. It stands on its front porch. It decides it's going to arm itself. It barricades its house, and it says to the Philadelphia Police Department, you will not come in our house anymore. You will not harass us anymore. This is our house. This is our property. Stay off of our property. Stay off of our lawn. Leave us alone. This is on May 20th, 1977. But the Philadelphia Police Department used every single one of the previous infractions and so forth, and basically say, you can't do that. We now are issuing warrants for your arrest, and a siege ensues. An almost year-long siege ensues in Powelton Village in front of this house, a terrifying standoff that eventually will result in every city member being involved, neighbors being involved, barricades being erected, and ultimately a horrific scene with 1,000 police officers, armed vehicles on August 8th, 1978, thousands of guns being fired. This is part of the erection of the barricade. A horrific scene. The basement being flooded with fire hoses, dogs kind of trying to get out of the basement, water up to here, pregnant women in the basement, men trying to get out, guns being whizzing from people up, snipers up in windows. And in this fray, a police officer gets shot. Huge controversy about where the bullet comes from, but we don't know, because within minutes after this, actually within a day after this happening, the house is completely bulldozed. All of the evidence is scooped up, but not before one of the guys in the house, Delbert Africa, is dragged out of the house. And this is all on tape. He's beaten mercilessly for a very long period of time. And then the guys who beat him up, get tried, nothing happens to them, but 9 members of MOVE get charged and convicted on sentences of 30 to 100 years for the killing of the one police officer. Some of them you may know if you've been following the news, were finally released. The upshot of all of this, what happened? What happened here at Powelton Village? Well, it was clear. Rizzo's police officers were clear, the media was clear, the city was clear. MOVE was a deranged cult. They were cop killers to boot. MOVE was not all blacks though, and this was really, really important. MOVE was not all blacks. They were the worst of the worst leftovers of the 1960s. They were the dreadlocked, the crazy, the militant, the nihilistic, the cop killer legacy of that now crazy, militant, over the top, lunatic decade. They were the part of the 60s that needed to be reined in. This is why we still needed Rizzo's officers. This is why Rizzo's officers still needed to be around. This is why we still needed to have a police force, even in the wake of so many complaints against us. However overzealous they might be, these were the good guys. And this is why they needed more, not less power. Now, of course, MOVE members were still people. They were less of the caricature that they were made out to be, but because they now had 9 members in prison for one person's death, which was no less tragic, no less horrific, but the question of this culpability was deeply problematic, they then go on this campaign to bring attention to the case of the MOVE 9. Which ultimately culminates in them getting another house in another part of West Philadelphia. This then means moving into the house that will lead to the confrontation in 1985, another row house. This is a different neighborhood though, very, very important. This is a Black middle-class neighborhood. This is a neighborhood in a different decade too. This is a decade where the war on crime is now in full force. This is a decade where the war on crime is now not only in full force, but the war on drugs is at fever pitch. This is a decade where Philly whites have not left the city because Philadelphia has a residency requirement for its cops. So much like Chicago, it's very neighborhoody in Philadelphia. So there is Northeast Philadelphia is all white. It's where all the cops live. There's also other pockets of white Philadelphia. So the city is very, very much a diverse city. And so to be in the city, it's very, very racially charged at all times. But the drug war is in full swing. And the cops have now very much been legitimated after 1978, plus are getting more so and more so because of the drug war, right? But the Black middle class has also gotten quite powerful too. And interestingly enough, there's now a Black mayor in office, Wilson Goode. This Black middle class is not only so powerful that it is a Black mayor, it has very, very, very high standing in multiple city agencies, including all of the ones that are going to be in charge of what might possibly be done with MOVE in its new house, right? And remember, now MOVE is in a new Black middle class, now a Black middle class area. Needless to say, MOVE at this point is getting more and more militant. They are now blasting from a megaphone in this house, rants to the mayor because they want something to be done about the MOVE 9. They want these cases to be revisited. They want some measure of justice to be done. The neighbors are sympathetic to this, but the neighbors are getting damn sick of the noise. And they want Mayor Goode to do something about it, just like the mayor should do something about any citizen constituents. What should the mayor do, though? It's interesting. What do the citizens want? Well, you would think what the citizens would want, again, the way you would look at the newspaper would be to come in and deal with MOVE aggressively, but that's actually not what the citizens want. What the citizens want is some kind of reconciliation, peacemaking, deal with these people's problem. Would you please deal with these people's problem? That's not what the city officials want to do, but what the cops want to do is, boy, they have been itching for this because they have not forgotten Ramp's death. That was the name of the cop. This is actually something that they had been very much hoping is now clear to me, looking at what's going on behind the scenes, very much hoping that there would be another opportunity to deal with MOVE. And let's be clear, MOVE itself is very much becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy at this point. MOVE is becoming increasingly cult-like. MOVE is becoming increasingly insular. MOVE is becoming increasingly, John Africa himself is becoming this kind of messiah figure. There's a whole nother history here, what's actually happening with MOVE, which is it's becoming smaller, it's becoming it's devolving itself. The cops' chance to deal with MOVE comes as more than 500 officers are gathered together on the morning of May 13th, 1985, and I'm wrapping this up, at 6221 Osage Avenue. The street had already been blocked off. All of the neighbors evacuated. Who are the neighbors? Again, these are postal workers. These are teachers. These are people who had worked their entire lives to buy these homes in West Philadelphia. They had all been evacuated. They had been evacuated on Mother's Day. They had been told that they would be back the next morning. And the police officers' plan was that they were these are row houses in Philadelphia. They were going to gain entrance to 6221. They were going to blow small explosives into the side walls. They were going to, if need be, use some rounds of ammunition. But they had an awful lot of ammunition, about 10,000 rounds of ammunition, high-powered weapons, including M60s, 50 caliber machine guns. And suddenly, everything went terribly, terribly, terribly wrong. Nobody was emerging from the house. Nobody was emerging from the house. It was all of a sudden, plumes of smoke are coming in from the house. And as one reporter described it, quote, at 5:20 p.m., a blue and white Pennsylvania state helicopter took off from the command post flight pad at 63rd and Walnut, flew a few times over 622 Osage Avenue, hovered 60 feet above the two-story house in the Black middle-class West Philadelphia neighborhood. Lieutenant Frank Powell, chief of the Philadelphia Bomb Disposal Unit, holding a canvas bag containing a bomb consisting of 2 sticks of Tovex TR2 with C4, and after radioing firefighters on the ground, lighting the bomb's 45-second fuse, and with the official approval of Mayor Wilson Goode and the assistance of Police Commissioner Gregor Sambro, tossed the bomb at approximately 5:28 onto the bunker of the roof. What followed shortly thereafter was a loud explosion and a large, bright orange fireball that reached 7,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Within seconds of dropping this combination of gel explosives filled with metal projectiles, the dwelling became a literal inferno, quickly engulfing every surrounding structure. Meanwhile, every gun on that block was being shot. When the bodies were finally discovered from inside of the house, Mayor Goode realizes with horror that 5 of the dead, there's 13 people inside, 5 of the dead are children. The costs of this block ride carnage were not just the deaths of so many people inside of the block on this row house, nor was it the 61 Black working class homes that were reduced to ashes. The cost of this assault on city taxpayers eventually topped more than $42 million. Oops, I wanted to show you this. Oh wait, I'll show you in a minute. But you truly cannot imagine the destruction of this. 2 full city blocks were gone in the city of Philadelphia. That this had been the response of the nuisance complaints of the neighbors was just unfathomable. But again, the message was to the neighbors, all of whom who had lost their homes. This was horrific. It was traumatic, but it was unavoidable. Move had forced their hand. Had they cared about their children, had they cared about their neighbors, they never would have forced this confrontation. This was the legacy of what the 60s was about. This is what it all comes down to. This is what unreasonable people push. This is what unreasonable people will demand, the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate conflict. But as with Attica, what really happened, I'm just beginning to peel this onion. It is crystal clear that what really happened, what really was obfuscated, dodged, and hidden is pretty profound. We all now know that there were many, many things going on that could have been avoided. First of all, we now know that the Philadelphia PD had an assault plan on this house that was about 2 years predating this actual event. One that included gel explosives, military grade explosives, and that in fact, the explosives that were eventually dropped, the Tovex explosives, which by the way, you cannot get these kinds of explosives. These are highly, highly controlled, like controlled substances basically, came to them from an FBI agent, Michael Macy, still trying to track down why the FBI gave the Philadelphia Police Department high-grade military explosives and why there was a plan to attack this house 2 years earlier. We also know a very significant piece of information that they knew the children were in this house, and not only that, that they had multiple opportunities to get them out when they knew that this operation was going to go forward in the week ahead of time, at least in the week ahead of time, if not sooner. In fact, Mayor Goode contacted one of the heads of the Department of Social Services, head of welfare, incidentally a Black woman, and basically said, I'm very troubled by this. What about getting the children out? Or actually one of his minions did. And her question was very simple. Are these moved children? And the answer was yes. And she was not interested in dealing with it or getting them out. We also know that the police chief was also asked about the moved children before the event. And he said point blank that he considered them not to be hostages, he considered them to be combatants. These are children as young as 7 years old. The public was already discomfited when it became revealed that at least 4 of the officers on the scene had also been present at the 1978 siege. In an interview I did 2 weeks ago, it turns out that there was more like 78 of the officers had been present at the 1978 scene. And this apparently has been kept under wraps by the police department until I just recently talked to this guy. We now know that the police department, we don't now know, this was actually known, but nobody really knew it enough to make a big deal about it, that the fire department actually tried to put out the fire, but was explicitly told not to. And we now know that when those houses were all burned to the ground, that what then happens afterwards is a dramatically interesting story about gentrification, fraud, corruption, and enormous profiteering that happens on the west side of the city. And if you've been following the news, we also know there is another horrific chapter of this that develops that has to do with the bones of the children that are then in the ashes of all of this, that when this all happens, cherry pickers come through. They don't even treat this as a crime scene. They don't even treat this as a burial site. They basically, the bones of the dogs, the children, the people, all get mixed up. They get thrown into garbage bags. They don't even try to process whose bodies are whose. Identities get mixed up. And those bodies of those children end up in the Penn Museum until basically a month ago, 2 months ago. And this is all just now coming to light. What does this have to do with the making of history? So I can be done with this. I think it means a tremendous amount. It essentially means that it had everything to do with how we came to understand why everything about the 80s was necessary, why it becomes okay, why the 60s was worth dispensing with in the moment. It has everything to do with how people came to understand their own trauma, how they deserve their own trauma, how they deserved the abuses that they were suffering in the moment, how they deserved the protectionism that they were given and the abusive protection that they were given, or at least told to understand it. It was also, it also is a profound reminder of how the archives and what we are given and what we were handed in the archives, even archives that at the time are critically curated, are so deeply problematic if that archive is curated by the very same people who were curating the scene at the time that is being that we are trying to narrate as historians. It has given us ideas about who is violent. It has given us ideas about what is crime. It has given us ideas about periodization. It has given us ideas about every iconic event and who is responsible for it, and countless probably not so iconic events, as I think Elizabeth Hinton's book has shown us so profoundly. And it gives us an opportunity, I think, to just take a moment to not think just about what happened, but how we think about what happened. In every iconic event of the 1960s and 70s, from Rochester and Philadelphia in 1964 to Oakland in 66, Detroit in 67, and here I'm thinking about like the Algiers Mortel murders, Chicago in 68, Orangeburg in 69, Jackson and Kent State in 70, Attica in 71, Wounded Knee in 73, Move in 78, and on and on and on. We just go on and on and on and on. The preponderance of the bloodshed, as well as the injury and the death to human beings, was caused, I'm not talking about property, I'm talking about human beings, was caused by law enforcement on unarmed citizens, exercising their constitutional rights to express their dissatisfaction with the practices and policies of their nation's leaders. The preponderance of the violence was state violence. So what do we mean when we say crime? What do we mean when we say violence? And how do we periodize it? And the preponderance of the pushback didn't stop. It didn't stop in 1968. It didn't stop in 1971. It didn't stop in 1976. It didn't stop in 1978. It didn't stop in 1985. And arguably, it's never stopped. So how are we periodizing it? And where are we defining these epics? And yet somehow the American public does, in fact, it's real, comes out of those decades believing that hippies are violent, civil rights protesters are violent, feminists are violent, protesters in general are violent. The period was getting excessive. Crime is, in fact, out of control before it does get out of control, which of course it does get out of control. But why does it get out of control? And cause and effect and chicken and egg. And historians do have a responsibility to weigh in on these things as much as sociologists do and political scientists do. And so the police end up with more power, not less power. And we, I think, as historians, do have a responsibility in the same way that we grew skeptical in about probably 85, I remember. I was a grad student. We got really skeptical when we looked at those 60s memoirs and those 60s movement documents. And we got skeptical of those as sources. We thought, yeah, those are biased. I mean, come on, that was a manifesto. That's a biased source. But we never looked at those, newspaper accounts or when we went to the archive, we didn't see those as biased. We thought, what, box 30, folder 20, I can cite that. If I got it out of box 20 and folder 30, and it was from the Library of Congress, I got this. That's a good footnote. But is it? And was that newspaper a good footnote? Well, not if it was the New York Times. On September 13th, 1971, it wasn't. It was a bald-faced lie that changed history. Thank you.
I'm not going to pose a question, but I do want to invite members of our virtual audience to post questions to the chat as well. Thank you.
Everyone's like, no. Come on, that was so speculative. Someone's got lots to say, I know.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's not a very technical question, but I'm just really curious because, the public record is so, as you said, contradictory, unclear what happened. What is the popular memory in Philadelphia around the MOVE bombing? Is there a legacy of feeling that it was, as you said, an incident of state violence, or is there an alternative set of meanings attached to it?
Of course, that totally depends when you're looking, so right this minute, right this second, in the wake of like the revelations about the remains, there's a fairly large consensus of, this was this horrific incident. And of course, so many Philadelphians don't even know about it. The most remarkable thing about the MOVE bombing is how few Philadelphians, let alone Americans, even know it happened, which is another whole thing I didn't even get into here, which is about the story of erasure. Before I wrote the Attica book, no one even knew Attica had happened. Before, the MOVE revelations, no one even knew it had happened, and how it's so extraordinary that Tulsa could have happened, no one knew about it. MOVE could have happened, no one ever knew about it. But now that people know about it, I think there's a pretty much consensus that that was a horrific act of state violence. But at the time, contemporaneously, people were like, they were a crazy cult. I have to say that even when I wanted to write this book, I got a tremendous amount of pushback from wanting to write the book. Like, really, you want to write about them? Like they're not a very sympathetic group to want to write about. And okay. The point is, like, they're still, and maybe they are, or maybe they aren't. And I think they're a really complicated group. They're certainly not a heroic group, but that's sort of so interesting to me, because it's almost like, not that they deserved it, but really anyone that you're going to lift up to write a story about, like, you're going to pick the one that was the crazy cult that got bombed, like, that's the one. So that really still lingers. I think the people who knew about it kind of thought, but didn't they kind of go to mine? Like, didn't they kind of deserve that? That was pretty powerful. So, but actually to your point, which shows you how important the storytelling about something is to how people will respond to it. Because now people are like, state violence, the police dropped a bomb on, on a Black family in West Philadelphia. I don't care who they were. They dropped a bomb on a Black family. All about the storytelling.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. I think I have a question kind of on that storytelling. I'm curious. I mean, it sounds like the police were definitely saying something to the press, like the mayor was involved, but I'm curious about like all the other state actors, the social service agencies and the fire department and like all the other people who were kind of around. Were they participating in how the story was told? Or like, yeah, what was their kind of role in how this got told to the public?
Way too long in my talk trying to do two stories at once. I didn't do justice really to the end of the story, which is to say that one of the things that is so clear in the MOVE story, it was also clear in the Attica story, but it's really clear in the MOVE story, is how important city bureaucrats and city bureaucracies are to this story. Everyone's hands are dirty. Just like every politician's hands are dirty in Attica story, it's true in MOVE that, you know, everyone was a participant in this at some level, right? And it's not so much what people did, it's what they didn't do. And that was true in Attica. At the end of my Attica book, the people that I was the most disgusted by actually, ironically, were not the cops who did the torture. I mean, yes, of course I was, but it's all the people that at any point in time, they could have corrected this trauma. They could have done something. They could have stood up. They could have stopped it, and they didn't. That's kind of the MOVE story on steroids, because people actually came to these people at all of those levels of city government and actually appealed to them to do something concrete. And they actually had real power to do things, and they didn't do them. But maybe that's also the nature of the bureaucracy or elected office or something.
Hi, thank you so much for a really wonderful talk. I just had two quick questions on some of the things you pointed to at the end. So you had this really intriguing list of, I think, sieges is maybe the best description of them, where you were listing Chicago and Attica and Wounded Knee and MOVE. And it had me thinking about Kathleen Ballou's work, which I was thinking about earlier as well, and whether you think things like Ruby Ridge, where the politics are different but actually have echoes, fit into that list. And then second, on your provocation of how we think about the archive, could you tell us a little bit more about the process for the MOVE work and how you're getting beyond whatever it was, it box 30, folder 20 and newspaper accounts, like how the archival work, you were thinking about it differently for this project. I know a little bit more about Attica, but I'm interested in that.
It's such I'm pondering the answer to your first question, and I know it's one that I've got to really think hard about. So the question is, if it's state violence, which I'm fundamentally persuaded that it is, of course, Ruby Ridge, Waco, and all of those things are relevant to this discussion. It is clearly about the overreach of state violence. But this violence is so palpably, demonstrably, and critically punctuated by the politics of race that it is not the same. And I am going to need to think, this is what top of my list in this book that I'm writing. I'm going to have to think very, very hard about how to theorize, not theorize, how to articulate why it's not just state violence, and what specifically about this state violence is about the protection of the color line. And that's what I said earlier. You might remember in the beginning of my talk. It's not just that it's state violence. It is about the protection and to ensure the unbudging of the cementing of the protecting of the color line. It's about protecting of capital, it's protecting about the status quo, but it is about the protecting of the color line. So it's not just about going out and showing your guns. And I need to come up with a much more sophisticated and eloquent way of articulating that I'm able to give to you right now, but that is foremost on my mind, because everyone's going to say, what about Waco and Ruby Ridge? Rightfully so, but it is not the same. There is a class component to that I need to also think about, but it's not the same. Archivally, it's very similar to Attica. People who are in positions of power, are masters at disappearing archival records. In the case of, in a weird way, the MOVE story is almost harder because there was this open door policy with the commission. So there's tons of records. So you'd almost think like it'd be easier, but weirdly it's not, because what everyone says, oh, it's all over there. It's all here. It's all here. And so I'm having a really hard time finding things that you'd think you would be able to find that aren't there. So the FBI stuff, the Justice Department stuff, there's a whole Justice Department investigation. I'm having a hell of a time finding that stuff. So again, it's like Attica, who has the copy? Who else was there? Who has the original? Who has the copy? Talking to people, tracking them down. And it's not pretty. It takes way too long. As Kelly Hernandez always talks about, it's like the rebel archive. It's like the archive, the side archive, and it's really frustrating.
Thank you. That was great. I just have a different kind of question. I mean, about erasure. But isn't the problem or the challenge with erasure that it works so well?
Oh, exactly.
I mean, so 40 or 50 years later, you come around and you go digging around and you dig it and said it wasn't so and it wasn't so, but it was a fact of power, right? That is to say, and so I wonder what you have to say about that. I mean, in a way, and so now you do something maybe similar in one way or another with MOVE, or, I mean, so it's maybe thinking about, I mean, you don't have to convince me that the work we do is, I wouldn't do it otherwise, but I mean, I want you to maybe reflect for us a little on
Why does it matter?
why does it matter, right? That is to say, so if 40 years later we know, from so many elements that Attica was a very different story, how does that impact us now? I mean, it corrects the record, it sets it straight. I think it does a kind of justice retroactively to people who were maligned in this way, who are often dead or elderly at this point and so on. But, I mean, part of it is what moves you then to do this kind of work, knowing that erasure worked and was so effective, and that there are many elements in society who were then and now pretty content with the erasure remaining the way it is, right?
Yeah. Well, you're asking me on a bad day, because we actually had lunch with your students in your department, and I think that a lot of us who do this work, and we may share this. This is a bad moment. I think we are all feeling a little bit like, why do we do this? It's feeling a little bit. We're all feeling a little bit like, why does history matter at some level, at some global level? But I will say that my hope is that two things. One, that for historians, that it does matter to me that we stop accepting the state's word for it, whatever it is. It matters to me a lot that we just stop accepting the archive. It matters how we train our students. It matters when someone says that they want to work on a project, that we just release them to the archive uncritically. And at least that's the way I feel like a generation of us were trained. I think it does matter. And I think it matters that we are really, really critical about the stories that we tell, more reflexive about the stories we tell. So that matters to me. I do a lot of policy type of work, and it is infuriating to me in the criminal justice world that we constantly see people take the word of the Department of Corrections. Whatever they say is what happened. It's never what happened. And so there's kind of a political project for me just about, no, don't ever believe what anyone tells you what happened. And so that's the historian in me, like we got to ask multiple sources what happened. But I think and a bigger, you're raising a much bigger point, which is, yeah, you know, when I did Attica, I was naive. You know, I thought if I named the shooters after 45 years, it might matter. And not a single reporter even bothered to interview the cops who had tortured and killed people, you know, because, you know, we don't even have enough money in our nation's reporting system to pay investigative reporters anymore. You know, so in that sense, it's incredibly depressing. But I do think we still need to not just accept the stories that we are handed. And as historians, we got to do better. We can't just accept the historiographical stuff that's handed us. A terrible answer, but like I said, you're asking me on a bad day.
You talked about the archive, and Attica was really problematic, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, because the court records were sealed. Is that correct?
Well, all the records are pretty much sealed. So all the state records are pretty much sealed. So it was kind of a dodging around and finding out. They're very hard to get. Some are sealed, some are not, but
Okay.
yeah.
Because that does make the work of the sealed by the state.
I mean, but it's all, they are sealed in the name of things like privacy, in the name of things like protecting grand jury testimony. But the journey of doing the book revealed to me that it was a lie. I had the entire index of what the state has only because a hapless state attorney general gave me the index. And so I knew exactly what I was asking for, you know, freedom of information. I knew that I was asking for, you know, this information from this box. I knew there was not a shred of grand jury testimony in it, and it was denied me on the basis of grand jury rules. So you're talking about a level of obfuscation that is criminal. And that is what we're dealing with here. And so when we are training generations of students to go, it shapes what stories we tell. It shapes what dissertations are written. It shapes how we understand the past, and it shapes, and then in turn, it shapes what journalists are going to write about, because they call us every day. You know, think about George Floyd summer. I mean, how many of us in here work on the 1960s and 70s? I don't know how many of us got calls. Well, is this like 1968? Does this remind you of 1968? Is this like the violent protests of 1968? If I got one more call from a reporter that said, so is this like the violent protests of 1968? And that just made me just want to like take a gun to my own head. Like, is this like the violent protests of 1968? You know, it just makes you want to just quit, because that is what they've gotten from all this. Is this like the violent protests of 1968? So imagine like, and that's the work we have done. That's the work we have done. So yeah, it's very, wow.
I will pose two questions from our virtual colleagues, two of whom are in the history department. So first from Dane, and maybe this one will be a little bit short. Have you found anything new about claims that the city of Philadelphia negotiated payments to move in the years between the two attacks?
Negotiated payments to move? Well, that they definitely tried to get them out of that Powelton Village house, and definitely tried to potentially get there was negotiations to maybe get them out into a rural farm. That's one thing that was definitely true. Payments between there, I'm not sure about that. I mean, they did try to indict them federally on weapons charges. A whole lot of stuff goes on in between, but I'm not sure about payments. But if you know something, send it my way.
And then from Ken Moss. So in both of the cases you addressed, it seems fairly clear that the police force was acting with a great degree of latitude, and in many ways made much of the choice as to what would happen with what intensity of violence, et cetera. To the degree that this is what you're finding, can you speak to the way the Fishers complicates what we mean by state violence here? Not to let anyone else off the hook, but are we talking about police forces acting as right-wing racist militias in ways that reach well beyond the intentions of other state actors? And how should we think about that sociologically and perhaps also in the present? And if I could
Mm,
append a little bit of my own question
Yeah,
to that, because
yeah.
it sort of connects to what you're talking about with the Black middle class. And I sort of thought about the 1980s in terms of thinking about, I'm sorry, that very technical and intellectual, I'm gonna get you sucker in that joke of like, we walked in with guns and we came out with jobs, you know, like, and so like just sort of made me think about that. And so I wonder if you could sort of connect maybe that to that question as well.
Oh, I think that's that's a really fabulous question. And it's interesting because it's part of that broader work. It ties to the question about Waco, right? It's part of my bigger work to kind of figure out, what do I mean by state violence? There is, I mean, not to give away the store, but I mean, that is my ultimate, that's my ultimate punchline in the book, right? It's going to be my ultimate thesis. What is state violence, right? I mean, what do I mean by state violence? The whole book is going to be really a thesis and a reinterrogation of what we mean by violence in general, but state violence in particular. It's really not about the police. It's really about state violence. And so that's part of the question. And I think that the longer term argument has always been, at least the way I'm understanding it, we've always assumed that the police are kind of a proxy for white, for a long time, we've kind of assumed that the police are a proxy for white working class people. It's been a kind of this kind of long-term trope, or at least kind of this silent majority kind of notion of the police being this proxy for white working class people. And I've got no dog in this fight to kind of resurrect white working class people. It's really not the point of this. The preponderance of the evidence in the stories that I'm telling is that the police, ironically, as white working class people, time and again seem as kind of the fodder in this story. At Attica, I mean, they have no business being sent in here. They're not trained for this. One of the things that happens is they are so traumatized by what happens at Attica. Half the reason why we know what we know about Attica ultimately is half of them crack up and end up testifying on behalf of, not half of them, many of them crack up, end up testifying in court, some of them on behalf of the Attica brothers. That's how we know they take off their identifying badges. Like, they are pawns in this in many respects. So the question is, who is the state? Who are the puppet masters? And of course, that's not really what I think, but you know, on whose behalf are they acting? So I actually don't think that they're acting as their own renegade force, because the officers themselves they go to work, and yeah, they're racist and they get riled up and they're chomping at the bit and they're going to shoot their guns 500 times. But who are they? I mean, they're, you know, if they would have happened to have landed a job at GM, who might they have been, right? The question is, on whose behalf are they doing this work? On whose behalf does this work serve? And it's pretty clear in Attica whose work it serves. The state of New York's work, and whose work does it serve in Philadelphia? So I'm trying to sort this out. I would be a liar to say I know the answer to this, but I'm not sure that they're fully independent. Now, is Good in charge of this? No. There's no question in my mind that Coleman Young and Mayor Good and all these Black mayors have no control over these Black police chiefs. But are they not benefiting from the class politics that these police chiefs are also probably? I don't know. They're certainly not benefiting from the race politics. I got to sort it out. This is the disadvantage of getting a talk in the middle of a book. I don't know.
Thank you so much for the talk, and also for the chance. Ken Pomerantz and I are teaching the graduate seminar this year, and we discussed your articles yesterday. And so some of the questions I'm sure that you got at lunch and that you've gotten here are reminiscent of that. But I want to go along the same line of thinking. I think that the last couple of questions have pointed us toward. And one thing I was thinking about is that, what does it mean when you think about violence to study spectacular violence rather than everyday violence? And what assumptions do we make about the continuities between the two when we study spectacular violence, right? Because I was thinking about that neighborhood in Philadelphia, and I was thinking about what would happen if we studied the texture of everyday relationships between the city and that neighborhood. You know, who gets fined for things, who gets the police to their door when they call them, you know, all those kind of daily things. are you sure that there would be continuity between that and the story that you're telling about MOVE, or might there be some interesting dissonances? And how do you come to that? How do you come to the conclusions that you come to about the continuity between the everyday violence and the everyday movers of durable inequalities and injustices, and what you see in these spectacular moments?
I love that. And I love that. That's actually a very deliberate choice on my part, as, I mean, should be no mystery that I don't choose these just by happenstance. They're very deliberately chosen to be spectacular, in part because I want it to be moments about which there can be much, much debate, much disagreement, much, pivot points where people can kind of obfuscate, hide, disagree, ponder, so those are actually chosen for a reason. But I'm not sure what the relationship will be. There's no question that, the way you even just described it, I would say that they're all, obviously there's multiple forms of violence. There's domestic, there's all kinds of forms of violence, but the kind of state violence that I'm interested in, which is the kind of violence that keeps as I'm calling it, sort of the unbudging color line and cementing the color line and protecting capital, that kind of violence can have unspectacular and very grinding everyday manifestations and could still be perpetrated by the parking meter person or the person that drops the bomb. So I'm not so sure even that those kinds of distinctions ultimately, for what I'm trying to figure out in terms of theoretically, will have to matter that much for the ultimate point that I'm trying to figure out. But what will always matter will be how it shapes the bigger narrative, because that's what's going to require the spectacular, which is how do stories get told about it? Like, I think it's essential that MOVE gets told to be a cult. It is essential that the Attica brothers get told to be people that would castrate white guards. That has to be a spectacular story, because Attica then becomes a prison that then gets referred to on cartoons, it gets referred to on television shows. It becomes symbolic of the worst prisoner in America. More so than any other prison. Like, everyone knows the name Attica. They don't know what happened at Attica, but Attica becomes symbolic of the worst, frankly, Black man in America who's a criminal and who's a thug. That's what what is the work that those events do? And the work that those events do have to be spectacular, but the actual work they do could be duplicative at all kinds of micro levels. Well, that's what I'm curious to know. Like, that's you're right to ask the question. It could be, but you're right. It maybe is not. But I'm curious to know by your question, in what ways might it not be? In what are you imagining that it might not be?
I think I'm just thinking about how we think about causality in the durability of certain kinds of inequality and certain kinds of unfairness and certain kinds of marginalization, and whether or not the logics that drive that are necessarily always the same logics that might drive an event like Attica or an event like the bombing of the MOVE house. And I think, if you take it at a real bird's eye view, then sure, we can say that there's racism at the heart of both of them. And, obviously wouldn't have any contest with that. But I think that at the level of policy and at the level of thinking, well, where do we make the change? It does kind of matter where the causality is and whether there's a consonance between those everyday forms of marginalization and violence in material and human sense, and the logics that are driving these more spectacular events. So that's where the question comes from.
Or even like intentionality. Yeah, I understand, or a causality, intentionality. Why is it happening in that moment? Yeah, I understand what you're saying now. Yeah, no, that's really important.